He had a spare pillow tucked under his arm, and a bottle of tonic wine in his coat pocket when the stagecoach rolled into Blue Stem. And Clay Bowen felt like the greatest fool in the territory the moment the door opened, and his mail-order bride stepped down without so much as a hand offered to steady her. "You must be Mr. Bowen," she said, setting a worn leather trunk on the platform herself before he could reach it. "Margaret Calloway. Everyone calls me Meg." Clay had pictured, from her letters, careful, polite, apologetic about her delicate constitution, a pale, thin woman who might need carrying up the porch steps. What stood before him instead was a sturdy, sun-browned woman with quick grey eyes and forearms that spoke of real work, dressed plain and practical, sizing up the ranch buildings behind him with open, unhidden interest rather than the fainting dismay he'd braced himself to comfort. "I brought you a tonic," he said, feeling foolish even as the words left his mouth. "For the journey. Your letters said you tired easy." Meg's mouth twitched. "My letters," she said, "were written for me by my cousin Adeline, who has a powerful sense of humor and thought it a fine joke to describe me as fragile so my future husband wouldn't expect too much labor out of me before the wedding. I apologize for the deception, Mr. Bowen, though I understand her reasoning. Men do some balk at a bride who can outwork them." Clay stared at her. Behind him he heard Deacon Ruse, his foreman, cough to cover a laugh, and felt his ears go hot. "I don't balk," he said, which was not entirely true, since he had spent the whole ride into town rehearsing gentle words for a woman he now understood did not exist. "Good," Meg said, "because I intend to earn my keep on this ranch same as anybody, tonic or no tonic." She glanced toward the corral where his horses stood watching the commotion with idle interest, and something sharpened in her expression that Clay would come to recognize in the following weeks as pure and simple hunger for a horse under her again, that bay in the corral. "Is he broke to saddle?" "Mostly," Clay said. "He's got a streak in him nobody's fully cured." "Good," Meg said again and picked up her own trunk before he could stop her. By noon the next day, half the ranch hands had gathered at the corral fence to watch Clay Bowen's new bride put that unbroken streak of a bay through paces that made even old Deacon Ruse, who'd been breaking horses since before Clay was born, whistle low through his teeth. She rode astride in a split skirt she'd apparently sewn herself for exactly this purpose, sat the bay's crow-hopping and sudden spins like she'd been born to it, and had the animal blowing easy and obedient inside the hour in a way 3 of Clay's best hands hadn't managed in a month of trying. "Your father raised horses?" Clay asked, when she finally swung down, cheeks flushed and grinning in a way that undid something stubborn in his chest. "Bred and trained them for the cavalry back in Kentucky before he passed," Meg said, catching her breath. "I was riding before I could properly walk, Mr. Bowen. I don't know why Adeline thought delicate was the selling point when it's the furthest thing from true, but I suppose she meant well." "Clay," he said. "Call me Clay. Seems foolish to stand on ceremony with a woman who just broke my worst horse before dinner." Meg smiled at that, easy and unguarded, and Clay found himself smiling back before he'd quite decided to. The weeks that followed unsettled every expectation he'd carried into the marriage. He had planned, in his private and somewhat sheepish imaginings, to shelter a frail wife from the harder truths of ranch life, the branding, the long dusty drives, the occasional necessity of riding out at first light into weather no sensible person would choose. Instead, he found himself working alongside a woman who rose before he did, who mended fence as competently as any hired hand, who had opinions about his breeding stock sharp enough to make him reconsider 2 decisions he'd been stubbornly attached to for years. "You've got that stallion crossed wrong," she told him one evening, studying his ledger of sires and dams by lamplight with the same intensity she brought to breaking a horse. "Too much size, not enough bottom. You'll get pretty colts that can't hold up over rough country." "That stallion cost me 2 years' profit," Clay said, more defensive than he meant to sound. "Then it's a fine time to learn from the mistake before you spend 2 more, Meg said, entirely unbothered by his tone, and tapped the page with one work-roughened finger. "Cross him with the Morgan mare instead of the thoroughbred line. You'll thank me by spring." He did not thank her that evening. His pride would not quite stretch that far yet, but he thought about her advice long after she'd gone to bed, and found, turning it over, that she was almost certainly right. It irritated him considerably that a woman he'd expected to comfort through fainting spells had instead outmaneuvered him on his own ledger inside a month of marriage, and it irritated him more, in a way he didn't examine Timon too closely, how much he was coming to admire her for it. Word of his capable new bride spread through Blue Stem quickly, the way most things did in a town small enough to fit its gossip on one main street. Old Mrs. Fenwick at the Mercantile allowed, with the particular relish of a woman who'd never much cared for Clay's bachelor pride, that it served him right to end up married to a woman who could outride him, and half the ranchers at the Saturday stock sale took to ribbing Clay good-naturedly about the wife who'd broken his worst horse before the ink on the marriage license was dry. Clay bore it better than he expected to. There was a particular satisfaction, he found, in a joke made at his expense when the woman at the center of it was the finest thing that had ever happened to his ranch. "They say you've got Bowen wrapped round your finger already," Deacon Ruse told Meg one morning, not unkindly, as she checked a mare's hoof with the brisk efficiency of long practice. "He's not wrapped round anything," Meg said, setting the hoof down gently. "We're partners." "There's a difference, Deacon, though I don't expect the men at the stock sale to see it that way." "No," Deacon agreed, watching her work with open respect. "I don't expect they will." Their loss. He had been skeptical himself, the day she'd arrived, of a boss's wife who claimed she could ride, having heard that particular boast prove empty more than once in his long years on the range. He was skeptical no longer. The trouble came on a hot, restless afternoon in late summer, when a rattler spooked the herd grazing along the east pasture and sent 200 head of cattle stampeding straight toward the narrow box canyon, where Deacon Ruiz and young Tommy Aldous were mending a washed-out section of fence. Neither of them aware of the thundering wall of horns and hooves bearing down on them until it was nearly too late. Clay was 3/4 of a mile off when he heard the roar of it and saw the dust rising, and his stomach dropped clean through the saddle, because he knew there was no way he'd reach the canyon in time to do anything but watch. He spurred his horse anyway, cursing the distance, picturing Tommy Aldis's young face and Deacon's grizzled steadiness both about to be ground under 200 head of terrified cattle, and for one long, sick moment he thought he would spend the rest of his life remembering the sound of what he was too far away to stop. Meg reached it first. She had been riding fence on the near side when the stampede broke, and rather than turn for safety, she put her heels to the bay, the same bay half the ranch had sworn was unrideable, and drove him flat out along the herd's flank, cutting hard across their path with a wild, fearless skill that had every hand who witnessed it swearing about it for years afterward. She got ahead of the lead steers, turned them with nothing but her own nerve and a horse she'd broken herself, bent the whole roaring mass of cattle into a wide curve that spent itself harmlessly against open ground instead of the narrow, deadly funnel of the canyon. By the time Clay reached the scene, heart still hammering with a fear he would carry the shape of for the rest of his life, Deacon and Tommy stood pale, but whole beside their half-mended fence, and Meg sat her blowing, lathered horse at the canyon mouth with dust caked thick on her face, and her hands still trembling with the aftermath of what she'd done. The last of the herd was still settling a 1/4 mile off, bawling and confused but alive, every single animal accounted for, and the silence that followed the thunder of their passing felt, to Clay louder than the stampede itself had been. "You could have been killed," Clay said off his own horse and at her side before he'd consciously decided to move, his hands coming up to steady her as she swung down on legs that did not quite want to hold her. "So could they," Meg said, nodding toward Deacon and Tommy, "and I had the horse and the skill to stop it, so I used them. I wasn't about to sit safe on a ridge and watch good men get trampled for want of somebody willing to ride into it." Clay looked at her, dust-streaked, trembling, utterly unrepentant, and felt every last careful, protective plan he'd made for a frail bride collapse into something far simpler and far truer. "I brought you tonic wine and a pillow the day you stepped off that stage," half laughing, half undone, "because I thought I was marrying a woman who needed sheltering. I've never been so wrong about anything in my life, Meg Calloway." "Margaret Bowen, if you don't mind," she said, catching her breath, a slow smile breaking through the dust and fear on her face. "I believe we said our vows 3 weeks back, in case you'd forgotten." "I hadn't forgotten," Clay said. "I just hadn't caught up yet to what a fool bargain I'd struck," marrying a woman worth 10 of any hand on this ranch. He drew her in against him, not caring who was watching, careless of dust and sweat and the last of the settling herd lowing in the distance. I love you, Meg. Not despite how little you needed my protecting, but for it. I've never respected a soul the way I respect you. Meg laughed, a little unsteady still, and pressed her face against his shoulder. I love you too, Clay Bowen, she said, though I'll admit I had my doubts the day you met me with a bottle of tonic, like I might faint dead away crossing the platform. In my defense, Clay said, I've never been so glad to be wrong about a woman in my whole life. That evening, with the herd settled and the fence mended and Deacon Ruse still telling anyone who'd listen about the wild ride he'd witnessed, Clay burned the last of the tonic wine in the stove out of pure embarrassed affection, and Meg laughed until she cried watching him do it. What'll you tell Adeline? He asked, watching the bottle hiss and blacken among the coals, when she asked how her fragile cousin's getting on out west. The truth, Meg said, leaning against him on the porch step with the last gold light going soft over the pastures. That I married a good man foolish enough to believe a joke in a letter, and clever enough to fall in love with the truth the moment he met it. Clever's a generous word for a man who packed tonic wine for a bride who could break a stampede single-handed, Clay said, and pressed a kiss to her dusty hair. I'll allow you clever anyway, Meg said. A woman likes to be generous with her own husband, now and again. Word of the stampede and the rancher's wife, who'd turned it single-handed, traveled faster than any gossip Blue Stem had produced in years. By the following spring, ranchers 2 counties over were asking Clay, half joking and half in earnest, whether his wife might spare a season teaching their own green hands to sit ahoy. She did. Clay only laughed and said she might, if the price was right, and Meg allowed she'd consider it, so long as nobody showed up expecting a delicate woman who fainted at the sight of a spirited horse. They built a life together on the Blue Stem Ranch that no one who witnessed its beginning ever mistook for anything but an equal partnership, and Clay Bowen counted himself, from that day forward, the luckiest and most thoroughly humbled man in the territory.